What's acceptable on social media is in a constant state of change. And behind each decision about what can stay and what should go, there's a big, expensive, often hidden industry of content moderation.
You can't have a usable platform if you don't do some sort of content moderation. Otherwise, every platform will just be porn and diet pills. This is expensive. This is hard. And the brand costs of not having a strategy are also higher than they've ever been.
There's a widespread understanding that the systems and the processes that are being used by big tech companies to manage their content challenges, they aren't working well. And that has huge impact on freedom of expression as well as human rights.
While some, like TikTok, directly employ content moderators, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube largely outsource the grueling, difficult work. They have contracts with a handful of companies, some in the US and some overseas, that employ thousands of moderators who sift through hundreds of posts every day, removing content that doesn't match platforms' community guidelines.
We had people who were trying to, sell drugs, and we had one instance where we were concerned if someone was trafficking children on Marketplace.
I've seen hundreds of beheadings in my complete career for content moderation.
While some companies are developing algorithms they say can take over the nasty work, machines cannot detect everything, like the nuances of hate speech and misinformation.
Humans will make the decisions. They'll make the judgment. This photo is not allowed. This type of, phrase, when it's said in this exact word is not allowed. And then what they do is they program the AI to look for repeated instances of this happening over and over again.
There's also a host of alternative social networks that rose primarily because they promised minimal content moderation. But that approach has its downsides as well.
Every user-generated content platform will have content moderation problems. It's just a fact, whether it is dating apps or whether it is, Peloton and people having QAnon hashtags in their usernames. There is just no escaping this now.
With debate swirling over how platforms moderate content and what is protected as free speech, one thing is clear. The online decisions have real-world implications for the businesses involved, for safety, and for the future of our democracy. That's why we wanted to find out just how big the business of content moderation has become and how social networks determine what content we can and cannot see. Content moderation was first thrust into the international spotlight following concerns around Russian interference in the 2016 election. Then in 2019, the murder of 51 people was live-streamed on Facebook at a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. It was viewed more than 4,000 times before Facebook removed it 17 minutes after it started. In the next 24 hours, Facebook had to remove 1.5 million different versions of the video.
It's not just going to be policy alone, but it's going to be companies stepping to the table with self-regulatory actions, understanding that this matters in terms of their reputational risk, as well as their performance of the models in which they create. No one wants to be part of a company that engenders hate speech and disinformation in ways that starts riots.
Twitter added labels to Trump's baseless election fraud claims in November. Following the Capitol riots, Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat removed Trump. Google suspended his YouTube channel, and Reddit banned some pro-Trump forums. The platforms are plagued with hate speech, racism, and misinformation about COVID.
Concerns around misinformation in the context of the pandemic, in particular, I think really changed the way that these platforms saw their roles in society about cracking down on false information because it could literally cause people to die.
What we're asking them to do is to keep us safe, keep us in a space that we know the networks will be resilient enough to help me discern when I'm being viciously attacked by somebody who is going to show up at my door or show up at the Capitol and take my rights away.
During such a volatile period like this, one of our top priorities is making sure that people don't use our platform to organize any violence or civil unrest.
Despite the focus, most platforms are not forthcoming about the specifics of how they moderate content.
The extent to which we're aware of how companies are actually engaging in best practices around content moderation, that matters, right? It matters to legislators so they can understand where the breakdown is.
The global content moderation solution market reached $4.9 billion in 2020, and it's expected to grow in a big way. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube use a combination of machine detection and human moderators. YouTube says they have 20,000 people broadly working to enforce policies and moderate content, while Twitter didn't disclose how many people it has on the job. Many of the human workers are at third-party companies contracted around the world. These include Genpact, CPL, Pro Unlimited, BC Forward, and Accenture.
So the contracts are really big. There's a lot of overhead involved with it. And as we're seeing more recently, there are legal costs. So there's money to be made in this business, but it is not a spectacular business.
The big platforms constantly have to change how it's done. Twitter now adds labels to tweets containing misinformation and blocks users in some cases, but says it remains committed to protecting the open internet. YouTube, meanwhile, sent content moderators home at the beginning of the pandemic, increasing reliance on automated filters. As a result, almost twice as many videos were removed in the second quarter of 2020 than the first. Facebook told CNBC it employs 15,000 content reviewers globally who look at several million pieces of content every day. Although the pay for moderators is low compared to pay for regular Facebook staff, the sheer number of moderators and hours needed means the cost is huge. While Facebook wouldn't give an exact number, a spokesperson told CNBC it spends billions on content moderation.
These are things that demand big investments. There is no cheap solution. Anyone who promises that there's a cheap, easy way to solve these problems is just lying.
In May 2020, after years of public outcry over moderation decisions, Facebook launched an independent oversight board with an initial investment of $130 million. Dex Hunter-Turek is one of the 20 board members.
Say Facebook makes a content moderation decision, they delete a post. That user can go through the appeals process with Facebook.
The oversight board makes rulings on a small number of major cases, like whether Trump can remain active on Facebook and Instagram.
It is the first time that Facebook has been required, as it is, to show they're working on these problems and not just come to the table and say, this is how we're doing it. And we think this is a really important part of holding Facebook accountable and putting more transparency into the content moderation process generally.
Many moderators are paid very little, especially overseas. They aren't allowed to discuss what they see, often even with coworkers. They make decisions on hundreds or thousands of posts a day.
If you don't have an accuracy score of higher than 90% for even a couple of weeks, you could be fired. So people were fired from these jobs all of the time, often with very little warning. And so there was enormous turnover at all of the facilities that I visited.
They see beheadings, child pornography, extreme violence, and things that never make it to our computer screens because of them. And many of those workers have PTSD as a result. And the workplace conditions are really bad. They're hugely underpaid. There's very little mental health support.
There are all kinds of cruelties, sexual violence of all kinds against children, against women, of course, against animals, even against dead people. So necrophilia was also one of the types of content which we were told about.
Moritz Rieseviek and Hans Bloch directed The Cleaners, a documentary about content moderators in the Philippines who work for one of the major platforms, although their contracts won't allow them to disclose which one.
Since our film was published, Facebook changed a lot. They got this new board, new rules, new ways of also taking into account like cultural differences and so on. But what didn't change at all is the way how these people applying these rules in a few seconds, how they are treated.
Facebook says that all its content reviewers now have 24/7 on-site psychological support, and that it's also offering some technical solutions, like blurring some graphic images or showing them in black and white. But hundreds of Facebook workers wrote a letter asking for better working conditions, especially during the pandemic, while some continue to work from the office because of the confidential nature of what they review. In a statement, Facebook told CNBC, AI has allowed us to proactively detect the vast majority of this content so we can remove it before anyone sees it. But it's not perfect. Since cultural nuance and intent also matter, we make sure that people are part of our enforcement process and are working to improve the way we support them all the time.
Facebook has agreed to settle with its moderators and will pay all of them at least $1,000 and provide ongoing mental health care to those who've been the most severely affected.
Newton reported about one moderator who died of a heart attack at his desk. An employee of the moderation company in The Cleaners took his own life.
He hanged himself in his house at the front of his laptop. 3 times, he already informed the boss, the operations manager, to please transfer him.
Pay them well, and then support them with the psychological support they need, and that for a lifetime. And then we can talk again about the decision making. But as long as Facebook and YouTube and Twitter treat this like a manufactory work, nothing will change.
Better pay and more mental health resources would greatly increase the cost of content moderation, which is one reason companies are looking to machines to do the work.
These jobs are not set up to treat people like people. These jobs exist because the AI isn't good enough. And until the AI is good enough, these companies are just going to hire people and treat them like they're robots. All the executives at these companies believe that this job will go away someday. And so it's treated as disposable and an unfortunate temporary expense.
The human part of content moderation is, for better or for worse, and often mostly for worse, becoming a smaller and smaller component of how platforms do content moderation. So much of how Facebook finds and removes content now is done by AI. And that's true for the other major platforms as well.
But Twitter, for example, told CNBC, we continue to invest in a combination of global teams and the use of machine learning and automation so that we can appropriately scale our work to support the public conversation. There are companies like Centropy and Hive Moderation making big bets on developing algorithms they say will take this gruesome work out of human hands. It's expected to grow to an $11.8 billion business by 2027. But experts say humans should always be part of the process, and former Facebook content moderator Sabrina Morales was told that too.
They kind of explained it away by saying they would always need, real people to fix their artificial intelligence programs, because even if we trained the system to recognize fraud based off things in a post, there were certain pictures that the scammers would use. Once you kind of figure out what the scammers are doing and you stop it, they kind of evolve and start scamming in different ways.
A sentence that might be perfectly innocuous today might transform over time to become something more sinister. We see this a lot with right-wing extremism, where they'll take an innocuous image like a frog, and then over time they'll use that frog in a lot of racist posts, and then over time that frog itself becomes an image of racism. It's hard for a machine to understand that. We need human beings to train it as the language evolves.
When you have millions of pieces of content and nearly 3 billion users around the world, of course we're going to need something which allows us to operate at that scale. But we also have an obligation to very carefully scrutinize how those systems are working and to find the problems which clearly will exist. There is no such thing as a perfect algorithm.
Freedom of speech is a driving force behind many alternative platforms with fewer guidelines and less moderation. Parler, Gab, Periscope, Rumble, and MeWe are some examples.
Parler and Gab became almost a backstop for people who had gotten kicked off of Facebook and Twitter and brought their audiences over to these platforms where they knew they wouldn't have too much moderation.
Citing a need for more content moderation, Apple and Android removed Parler from the app stores, and Amazon Web Services stopped hosting the site after the Capitol riots.
We're now at a quagmire where we have to determine what is free speech versus what is responsible free speech. And how do we create a safe and secure environment for the exchange of these ideas? And unfortunately, we're just seeing this regress, particularly in the civil rights protections of a variety of groups, where, normalization of violence is not something that we want to see every day on these platforms.
Then there's other platforms looking for creative, affordable ways to moderate content.
Right now, the smaller networks are all kind of along the lines of Facebook and Twitter in the early days, where they want to have a hands-off approach. But in time, an entirely hands-off approach just never works for any platform. You need to eventually make difficult content moderation choices. And I think that will just happen as they mature, because it's never a company's first priority. The first priority is always growth.
Nextdoor, for example, saves on hiring moderators by relying on volunteer neighborhood leads and more than 100,000 community reviewers who vote on whether to remove reported content or close down discussions. But some users have criticized it, saying it's not a safe space for people of color. Now, Nextdoor has announced an inclusion and anti-bias training program for their volunteer moderators. and says reports of racial profiling are sent directly to Nextdoor staff.
Who's to say a moderator sitting in a warehouse or sitting in an office building is going to know better than a handful of users who've watched the conversation go on and have the context.
Reddit also saves money by relying on users and volunteer moderators, or mods. Reddit's adjusted its stance as it's grown.
It almost flipped a switch and went from being anti-content moderation to being pro, and took some pretty extreme action against the seedier parts of its platform.
It's now removed entire subreddits like Watch People Die, and made some more tame. TikTok has a different approach for moderators, hiring them in-house. It's gained a reputation for a positive working environment.
In Ireland, a lot of moderators have been moving from working on Facebook content moderation to working for TikTok because the employment conditions at TikTok are better. It's clear and common now that the content moderators for Facebook get a really bad deal.
Debate is swirling around whether federal regulations should force companies to do more moderation, and if moderation should happen at all on new platforms like Clubhouse that only has live audio chatter.
Audio and video content is much more difficult to moderate, and I think that means that we have these big blind spots in content moderation.
So any new platform, any new social media company should really take heed that your institution of content moderation strategies that allows you to be more inclusive, much more discerning, are going to make you a star in this next round of the internet. If you disavow that, you're going to find yourself too on the front page of the newspaper because of some of the malfeasance that may come by just simply not taking heed to these new lessons.
On March 25th, Congress will hold a hearing over how platforms have allowed misinformation to spread, with testimony from Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter's Jack Dorsey, and Google's Sundar Pichai. While there is regulation like Section 230, which gives immunity to companies from what people post, there remains little guidance on what platforms should and should not be moderating.
We know the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is looking into Facebook, and the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is looking into Google. But these companies just tend to get away with every line that they cross.
While the U.S. debates the merits of moderation, some countries have passed stringent regulations. Germany, for instance, requires social media platforms to remove violent hate speech within deadlines as tight as 24 hours, and to report certain criminal content to the police.
The left wants platforms to moderate more, and the right wants platforms to moderate less. And so no one's really happy with what platforms are doing, but we don't really know what the end point should be. And so that's a pretty fundamental question that we have to answer before we can answer what laws should look like.
Independent oversight of content moderation is something that many experts agree could help.
It really is going to involve all hands on deck between the technologists and the civil society organizations and elected officials, basically people who get this.
What makes this so hard at the end of the day is that society itself is always reevaluating what is appropriate, what is harmful, and what can be defended as free speech.
Of course, the internet is always going to be filled with terrible things, but the question is what you do about it. At least right now, we know we have companies that are engaged in trying to make their spaces as comfortable for people as possible. So I definitely see hope for the way the internet is moving. And ultimately, I just think that the free market is going to make these companies move towards creating environments for users where they're going to feel comfortable scrolling and posting on these platforms. And that's really key.